Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I am your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm the other co-host, Matt Bernico. Hi.
Hi. Bringing in the energy hot already. I appreciate that. It is getting late, so we'll keep it up here. It's bad out there, folks. It's bad news all week this week, and
I feel like that's how we're always starting the show off these days. It's always bad. It's like COVID's bad, politics are bad. It's all bad. Dean, what's something good that's happening in your life? Tell us about that. What's good?
What's good? Okay, I started playing a game that you told me to play called Ollie Ollie World, and it's saving my life. It's an extremely simple game. Well, I shouldn't even say that. It's deceptively complex. It's a game about skateboarding, a side-scrolling skateboarding game in a world that is basically Adventure Time, but is not Adventure Time. And it's great. It's really a good, soul-warming, heart-warming game to find.
I agree. I've been playing it. It's been very fun. And here's the thing about video games. Some people, okay, this is such a bizarre thing actually to say at the top, but there's an ongoing debate within people who think about video games. Should video games be about playing a game, or should they be about telling a story? That's the conversation that video game academics have. And what's cool about Ollie Ollie World is that the story not important, and in fact, in most talking portions of the game, you get the opportunity to skip it. The cool thing about Ollie Ollie World is its approach to game design is like, can they make this game feel good for someone who plays it? It's like, and I think that's what it does so well, is it just feels extremely good. It's very cathartic. It releases all the endorphins. Your serotonin is flowing, and it's just a very good feeling game to play. I love it.
Yeah, everything about it. The sound is good. The colors are good. It's all good. It's a good game.
I've been listening to the soundtrack just as I work during the day, and it's very good. It's awesome.
All right.
Just some great like synth pop. Man, I could talk about this game for a long time, but let's not. Let's talk about the bad things.
Well,
done the good things.
No. All right, you gave it to me. I gave you one good thing. You can't just steal my good thing. Give us at least one other good thing that's going on.
Let's see. One other good thing. Let's see. Oh, here's a Breath of the Wild update. My son is now to the point where he is fighting and beating Ganon all by himself at the very end of the game. So he's a big boy. He's really grown up. He's beating the bad guys all by himself, and I love it.
Wow, he'll be graduating from college in no time.
I know. So in Breath of the Wild, there's a very tricky mechanic where you can deflect someone's shot with your shield, and it's a very satisfying thing when you can get it done right. And I've seen him play Breath of the Wild for I guess like a year and a half, and he's an expert at it. He's so good at it, and he can beat Ganon and all the robots, and he never stops talking about it. It's great.
I love it. That is fantastic. Well, this has been our brief video game podcast, the Magnificast plays video games. But yeah, let's get back to the bad news. So, war in Ukraine, that's what's going on this week. And Matt and I should have recorded this podcast earlier in the week so we didn't have to talk about it. But here we are at the end of the week.
We really got ourselves on that one. Yeah, if we a day sooner, and it wouldn't have been a problem.
So now we're compelled to talk about it. But also it is an important thing to talk about. And I feel like I've been thinking about it probably like everybody else a ton. So hopefully we have some things to say. The simple part, I think, is that war is bad. It doesn't matter who's doing it. It's not good. It's a bad thing. There's some nuances maybe to draw out about things like violence and all that kind of stuff that we've talked about in the show in the past, but at the end of the day, war hurts regular people more than anybody else, and that's my hot take right at the top of the hour here.
It's a good hot take. People, I've seen people coming out of the woodwork on Twitter posting the most wild things to say about the war in Ukraine, and I don't have time for them. I'm busy. I just don't care, I guess, is maybe what it comes down to. Whatever your weird Marxist-Leninist conspiracy theory is about Vladimir Putin or whatever, I don't care. I don't, no matter what you tell me about him, I don't think this is a good thing. I think war is bad across the board there. Intercapitalist wars are bad, and there's nothing you can say to change my mind about that.
Yeah, same. But that being said, it's true that there are some complicated things to parse out, and I don't know, we're not experts in geopolitics. Very few people are, and probably don't even want to listen to them anyway. But there are some geopolitical complexities here, and I think that actually some really interesting voices in the Christian peace movement have actually given us some ways of talking about them. So we'll rely on those in a moment. But I think really the thing I want to talk about most in this episode, the thing that I've been thinking about, is the need to really rebuild an anti-war movement or a peace movement, however we want to refer to it, in the countries that we live in, specifically in the United States and Canada. Uh, the anti-war movement has historically been an extremely powerful engine for social change, and it has bled into lots of other stuff. So, people show up at a demonstration to oppose a war, and all of a sudden they're also learning all kinds of things about whatever it might be, racism or socialism or imperialism or all these other kinds of things that are happening. And I think it's important to see the anti-war movement, first of all, as an extremely important thing because war is bad, and also as a historically very important vector of like people coming together with lots of different interests from lots of different groups united around the cause that war is not good. So, what better time to talk about the importance of rebuilding the anti war movement than when there is a big war happening in Europe and the United States and Canada are both involved in their own ways?
Yeah, I think that's about right. The anti-war movement, I mean, it fluxes, it ebbs and flows. There are times when it was really massive, and there are times when it's very small, like right now. And yeah, I think that Christians always have a certain place within that conversation. I mean, if anybody should care about people, it's Christians. So like, there's something really specific too that Christians should be contributing to this conversation. So yeah, in this episode, we're going to take a look at some of that and maybe try to make the case for why Christians and people on the left in general should just really be more invested in an anti-war position.
Yeah, and talking about what that means too. Christians, in my experience, are very good at having positions, not very good necessarily at
That's true. That's true.
at organizing around those positions. Not always true, but also partly true. I think it's also important to. So I made this tweet about basically this point that it's really important for Christians to start rebuilding those anti-war movements in the U.S. and Canada. And I've been, maybe I shouldn't be surprised at this stage, but I have to confess, out of my own naivete, I have been surprised at some of the responses to that tweet, especially the ones who are like, I don't know if you've heard, but the war is not in the United States or Canada, it's in Ukraine. Or like, the US and Canada are not the ones invading Ukraine right now. And I don't know, like, whatever. They are involved for sure. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But and of course not involved in the same way that Russia is involved. So I'm not trying to do a both sidesism here in the same way. But I think really the key point is that peace is a global project. That is a really important thing to recover. And I want to try to drive that home a lot in this episode that, what's that famous Martin Luther King quote that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere?
Sure,
I think you
yeah.
can, really scale that problem up when it comes to, people actually dying in wars and so on. So
Mhm.
war is a global problem. Peace is a global challenge. And anyway, all that to say, I guess I'm just defending my tweet to a bunch of people listening to this podcast. But it's just important to recognize that what we do in our own countries does have major ramifications for everywhere else in the world, especially in the heart of imperialism.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the United States and Canada, they are not directly involved at this point, but it's also not like they aren't involved in some way, right? Like drafting sanctions and whatnot. There's all kinds of ways in which the this particular situation in Ukraine is like a global situation, right? It's things are entangled enough that I think that is pretty
Mhm.
clear.
Well, let's maybe do a little quick review of what people have already been saying about the war in Ukraine. And I think, I don't know, I've been tracking like different Christian organizations, obviously, and what they have to say. There's been a lot of good statements from religious orders. The Sisters of Mercy had a good one. I don't know, tons of them. Probably if you know about a religious order, they've said something about Ukraine and good for them. Um, Genuinely. But I think the best one I've seen so far actually comes from Pax Christi, which is an international Catholic movement for peace. There is a really strong Pax Christi US movement that is full of very good folks. Shout out to John Noble if you're listening to this podcast. Love John, friend of the show, John Noble. Anyway, Pax Christi released a great statement, and they do a good job, I think, by I guess like pulling out not just the fact that war is bad, but again, really attending to why it matters to say that in the United States. So they say a bunch of other stuff. They talk about Russia specifically. So just to put that on the table. But then they have this important passage where they say, Pax Christi US urges the international community to stand united against the invasion of Ukraine and in support of diplomacy and dialogue to bring the crisis to an end. We urge the United States and NATO to refrain from pursuing military responses and to pursue solutions that address the context and complexity of the root causes which gave rise to the crisis in the first place. It should not be lost that, in addition to Russian aggression, the expansion of NATO with the proliferation of bases, the continued manufacturing of weapons of war, and the reliance on security upheld by military power has played a significant role in the events building up to the current crisis. This war is an additional evidence of the failure of policies predicated on the threat of violence to deliver the peace and dignity the human family deserves. There's a bunch of other stuff in there that you can read, but I just pulled that one out, I guess, to kind of keep on building that case that it really makes a difference that we come at this issue from our own countries, trying to figure out how we are entangled in the issue and involved in the issue, and figure out what the pressure points are that we can actually maybe push on. And I really appreciate Pax Christi's attention to saying, we can't just kind of shift the blame completely to Russia, even though Russia is the one bombing Ukraine. But we have to really have a much bigger and more historical view of like the conditions that create those contexts in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. It's a helpful map, right? It shows us where we are in the conflict, but also like the ways that we are embroiled in it, and great. Cool. Another really good statement I saw earlier today was from the Poor People's Campaign, written by Liz Theo Harris and William Barber, two pastors who are, leading a movement of poor people in the United States to confront the inequality of our country in particular. They have a really strong way of talking about the problem of militarization in the United States. They kind of are picking up the threads from like the Martin Luther King Jr. Poor People's Campaign, who recognizes militarism as like one of like the core problems in the United States society, and I think that they're probably right to do so. Anyways, they released a really good statement about today, and something I really appreciate about it is that it doesn't really dwell on the international politics of the situation because they are super complex and kind of ever evolving. And instead of talking about it in particular, like the Pax Christi one does, the Poor People's Campaign statement instead just kind of pivots towards a moral language and kind of painting a moral vision for like what an anti-war movement might look like. And I think that's cool. I mean, it's really helpful. I think both sides are actually really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
One that recognizes and maybe says things very explicitly, and then one that kind of paints a bigger imaginative picture. I think they're both pretty welcome in my book. So I'm going to read two parts from the Poor People's Campaign statement here. So it starts off like this. As always is the case with war and violence, poor and low income people lose the most. In a war over geopolitics and oil, poor people become pawns as autocrats play dangerous and deadly games. This act of war is in part the result of a Christian nationalist project developed by Vladimir Putin and supported by the likes of Donald Trump and his followers. We'll talk about the Christian nationalist part kind of at the end of the show here, but it is actually significant in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes on to say a little bit later, we stand with the people of Russia who immediately took to the streets at great personal risk to nonviolently protest this war. We stand with the people of Ukraine who have been resisting the drive to war and nuclear annihilation. We must pose the question, what if those of us who stand for peace around the world refuse to cooperate with evil? Millions of people, fathers, mothers, grandparents, and children, could nonviolently lock arms like thousands are doing in public squares of Russia even now and build a nonviolent movement for peace, justice, and democracy. I think this is very cool. I think in a lot of different ways. It recognizes, I think what we said at the top of the show, right? War is always bad because war hurts the people who have like very little means to do anything about it. Poor and low income people are always the people who are losing the most in war, and they're the people that are going to be, forced to the front lines to, fight in some circumstances, especially as we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, and that's very interesting and awful. But also, it's just like they will end up their lives will be disrupted, their businesses and places of work will be destroyed, damaged, all kinds of things happen during like wartime situations to people who are poor and low income. They don't afford the same possibilities to escape, to run, to just move somewhere else, to immigrate. All of these things are oftentimes not possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good a good part of a good argument for like why war is just like across the board bad, and why we can just reject it outright. I think, especially in these like sort of intercapitalist situations. Okay, so there's that. And then the second piece that I think that's really fascinating is that like, what if we just didn't? is what it suggests, which is on the one hand extremely utopian. But I think that in when it comes to like giving a moral language to these, I think I don't know, the utopian has a particular place in these. Like, what if we just chose not to do war? What if we just chose not to sit idly by while our governments, whether they are involved directly or not, create economies and political structures that completely are just like okay with like shoveling shoveling tons and tons of dollars into buying more missiles or something. What if we were not okay with that suddenly? What if we organized ourselves in such a way where we decide that's not an okay society to have? And that's good. Yes, we should. So I think what's cool about this thing from the Poor People's Campaign is that it suggests that like the people that we need to look to are the people who are already non-violently resisting. You know, violence and nonviolence are complicated ideas, as we've talked about in this podcast a lot, but that's where this is kind of drawing its energy from, right? There are already people that are opposing this war. And what if we just decided to do the same thing and oppose this war and all wars and all, all structures of militarism? And it's a good word.
Yeah, I think so too. That emphasis on organizing, especially, I think, is what I find missing in so many statements on the war in general, right? Like, I don't know. It's pretty hard to write a statement about the war in Ukraine that ends up sounding too bad, I guess. Just because it's like
Yeah.
easy to be like, yes, it's an awful thing and we stand with the people of Ukraine, etc. And the sentiments are good. Like I think it's actually important to express those sentiments, but even more important than that is to really do the hard work of thinking through what's the action item attached to that, what's the kind of way we need to think if we actually want to do something about that. And it's so easy and tempting to, I guess, reduce our action to having the right take or the right opinion, or
Hmm.
I don't know, arguing about it in the correct way on the internet. And it really makes a difference to frame everything in terms of, what if we built a movement that was capable of confronting this in a real significant way? That is exactly the right way to think.
Yeah, totally. I mean, even organizing is still too diffuse as
Yeah.
an idea, but it is in the right direction, right? I don't know. I don't expect anyone's statement about the war to lay out a strategic plan
Right.
for organizing or something. That's not the nature of press statements. But still, I mean, it's a step in the right direction. But yeah, I mean, exactly. We should build a movement that can that has the ability to articulate those particular types of strategies, though. Like, how would we confront those types of powers, or how would we confront the entire like system of militarization?
Yeah. Well, I want to turn to that in just a minute, but I think before we move to the organizing piece, the more important piece for sure, maybe it's worth just really, really briefly articulating kind of a last note about why this matters in the US and Canada in the context of the Ukraine stuff. So, I mentioned the Pax Christi statement has this really great note about the kind of conditions leading up to this, right? The expansion of NATO, the kind of paranoia that gets created in Europe through that kind of stuff, and in the United States through NATO. And I guess I don't know, if you're like around the left long enough, you learn a thing or two about NATO. But if you're not, probably you don't. I probably wouldn't have. And it might be worth just doing an extremely brief like explanation of why that is important, like why Pax Christi, for example, might go out of their way to say that. So okay, let me say right off the bat, I think it's pretty obvious like Russia has a kind of outsized role to play in the conflict, right? That they are the ones who invaded Ukraine, and that's true. That was a bad idea, not a good thing, and the scales are maybe tipped in that direction in terms of like bad stuff, bad bad actors. But at the same time, what's important is to recognize that something like NATO, which is a military alliance between the United States and Canada and Europe, and a handful of other parties, I guess. It existed initially as a way of confronting the Soviet Union in Europe, or kind of deterring or creating a potential front for war with Russia in Europe. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was kind of an assumption that, if Russia is going to get integrated back into the world economy now that it's no longer a big spooky communist country, then they shouldn't, like the West also should not kind of conscript countries on the Russian border into NATO. And that was sort of a deal that was brokered or made. And over time, that deal hasn't really been honored, and Ukraine is one more potential kind of, NATO candidate. And because it borders Russia, Russia is very nervous about it. So it's basically like a big game of capitalist chicken that's going on here, right? It's like you have the Western powers or the NATO powers who are kind of they're like propping up Ukraine as this poor kind of state that should be drawn into this alliance to confront Russia. And then Russia is trying to paint Ukraine as, basically like a proto-fascist state that they have to defend themselves against. And like the weirdest part is, as in all war, there's like kind of actually a little bit of truth on both sides. There has been historically in the last less than a decade some pretty severely frightening fascism building in Ukraine, like very brutal anti-Semitism, extremely bad neo-Nazi movements, and the U.S. and Canada both were sometimes in an indirect way and sometimes even in a direct way supporting those kinds of things. So like basically the point I'm making, I guess, is paranoia is kind of the underlying cause here, and that is very bad. So all that to say, I guess I think I just felt we should deliver a little bit on the thing we've hinted at, which is that there are these kind of underlying causes that are not reducible to like Putin being a bad guy who's doing a bad thing. Which, again, to be clear, he is a bad guy doing a bad thing. But just to say that if we're going to rebuild something like a peace movement in countries like the US and Canada, it matters that we also take the time to try to figure out, well, what is the unique role that they play? How are they kind of stoking the situation? And, how can we kind of confront that? How can we deal with those paranoia creating mechanisms or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I think that's actually a really great explanation, though, for why people in the U.S. should actually really care about an international anti-war movement, right? Like, I don't know, this conversation's been happening in our Patreon Discord channel, kind of on and off for the last few weeks, as we've all been waiting to see like what's going to happen in the situation. But yeah, I mean, like you said, Canada and the United States have both directly and indirectly acted in training uh, Ukrainian sort of paramilitaries, some of which are Nazis, really explicitly, right? So I don't know. To me, this is it helps strengthen the case when you learn more about the things that your government is doing. I think it's it's easier to just be like, this is bad,
Right. And it helps too to avoid like, okay, people absolutely 100% without qualification should stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, no doubt about it.
Totally.
Um, but it's important too to recognize that like we also have to pay attention to the different contradictions that exist in Ukraine by virtue of all this awful paranoia, right? And like
Yeah.
try to be mindful, I guess, about how that messaging goes out.
Contradictions is the exact right word. There's a lot of moving parts here. It's very complex. It's very complicated. The moral language of being anti-war because it hurts people who really have like no real stake in it. I think just to me, it rings the most true in
Yeah.
these situations,
Yeah.
right? Like, of course, there are like the sides are complicated for sure. But I guess like when it comes to like whose side do you want to be on, and I think in both cases, I guess it's always just like the people who are going to be hurt the most. Like, how
Mhm.
do you sort of stand in solidarity with the people who have the most to lose?
Yeah, exactly. All right. So that is the view at 1,000 feet, maybe, of that. And going back to what I said is the most important point, the organizing point. Maybe we could turn a little bit to that. So, it's wild because the United States in particular is, I think you can say pretty fairly, the most militaristic society that has ever existed on the face of the earth, right? More weapons than anybody, more weapons technologies than anybody. It can blow up the planet a bunch of times if it wants to. Not a good situation. And yet, at the same time, it has been home to an incredibly creative anti-war movement, and one that in some situations historically has been extremely powerful and effective at even forcing its own government to get out of wars. For example, most famously in Vietnam. And it has not always been successful, as the United States is still going to wars all the time. But it's important to kind of, I guess, honor that tradition of anti-war organizing in the U.S. And the same is true of Canada. It's a different conversation in Canada. I mean, really, we could do two whole episodes probably on it, but on each country. But Canada is often seen as sort of a Pacific power, right? Like, doesn't get involved in the same way that the U.S. does. Doesn't have these kind of imperialist interests. That's the brand that gets spread around, but that's not quite true either. Canada really likes making weapons and selling them to people. Famously, like Canada made a big sort of show of being out of Vietnam as a kind of active combatant, but we were like in Ontario. Canada was a primary producer of like Agent Orange, right? So like one of the worst weapons ever used in that war, right? So all that to say, this country too is not blameless, and also Canada is home to an interesting anti-war movement as well, including one made up of lots of deserters or like people avoiding the draft dodgers who moved to Canada, right? So there's an interesting tradition of all that here too. So I thought maybe one thing we could do if we were thinking about how to rebuild the peace movement. I think for me, whenever I think about big things like that, like what if we did this or that, what if we needed a revived labor movement or whatever, I'm always like, well, I can't really start from scratch. That's too big. So maybe instead we could kind of look to history a little bit and think that through. I don't know. How does that sound, Matt? As a way of getting some precedent, some permission?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds great. I mean, it's good, right? You want a new anti-war movement? Well, look at the one that we had and then lost.
Yeah. So, all right. I think you could say pretty fairly that the anti-war movement peaks in the 60s and even has a pretty strong contingent in the 70s and some interesting mutations almost in the 70s, and then begins to wane in the 80s and really sort of collapses in the 90s. And by the time you get to something like the Iraq War, you get kind of like a pretty solid revival in some respects, but not to the same degree or caliber. And then again, I think we're in a low ebb period of all of that, a valley, I guess, of the anti-war movement. And maybe this will change some of that. My guess is probably not. People seem to have a hard time kind of drawing the links between why would I get excited about an anti-war movement when the U.S. isn't the direct military power involved in the war that's in the news. So we'll talk about all that maybe later on, but just to get to this history piece. So when we talk about like the 60s and 70s, that's where my brain always goes. I think really you get like, I always think of, there are more interest groups than this, but I always think of three, which are, there's the labor movement in particular. And then there's, you could call it like civil society organizations. So like the civil rights movement or anti-racist movement and like the student movement, all these kinds of like civil society organizations that are sort of, bumping up against each other or kind of bleeding into each other, overlapping. And then lastly, just by virtue of this podcast, I guess, I always think about the emergence of an extremely strong Christian anti-war movement, Christian peace movement. So maybe we could talk through those a little bit. I don't know. Where should we start, Matt?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's talk about labor. Let's do that.
Good. I'm into it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the thing, so somebody in the, I'm just plugging the Discord chat left and right here, but somebody in the Discord asked about, has organized labor been involved in anti-war movement or like shutdowns and strikes and whatnot in response to like weapons manufacturing? And the answer is yes, and it's happened in a handful of different ways. I think the first time, this is I'm breaking the chronological order that we're working through here, so sorry. I think the first time I recognized this happening, or I remember it happening, or maybe heard about it, was just as I was starting grad school, I guess, but it was 2008. And I'm sorry, this isn't grad school. I was in a regular college. It doesn't matter. Anyways, in 2008, this is during the Iraq War. Like thousands of dock workers in a May Day protest, they closed like 29 ports to protest the Iraq War. Um, this is the ILWU, the International Longshore Workers Union, which is an extremely militant and cool union. If you want to know about any of them,
Yeah.
they're especially pretty like. I mean, I don't know. There's one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and they are actually like separate for some interesting reasons historically, but not really worth getting into right now. But the ILWU on the West Coast, they are like not constantly, but that is a tactic that they use to shut down the ports. And they've done it a few times. And even some things like the Occupy movement had some like synergy with them as well, and shutting down the ports for May Day too in past years. So that's the thing that's happened in our lifetime, my lifetime at least. I don't know. If someone's listening to this that was born in 2008, that'd be surprising to me, but you never know. Anyways, that happened in 2008, but there's a sort of a longer history of that as well. For example, here's a little blurb from Labor Notes that kind of just says a few things about this. The International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU, represents 25,000 workers on the West Coast docks and has the reputation for progressive leadership, democratic procedures, and international solidarity. It became, in 1964, the first U.S. union to oppose the war in Vietnam. And during the 1980s, it supported actions against El Salvador's government and held a port protest against apartheid in South Africa. So, I mean, there are other instances of this in American politics, but this is the one I would definitely point to if people were like, how has labor been involved in anti-war politics or anti-war movement in the past? The ILWU shutting down ports is pretty iconic, I think.
Mhm.
But it's a great example of the type of power that you really need to build, right? Do you actually want to stop militarism? Well, you need to employ or become involved with the folks who could actually stop that, like physically, so that the weapons and the materials that you would need to build weapons can't enter or leave the country. That is the first, the first and perhaps most basic sense of obstruction when it comes to stopping militarism.
Yeah, I mean, the longshore workers are so amazing in so many ways. Man, if you ever want to just get excited about a union, you should read about the longshore workers.
That's the one.
That's the
Yeah.
one for sure. Amazing stuff on lots of fronts, but yeah, especially on war. There are some really interesting stories of the longshore workers also like refusing to deliver goods to like particular countries or powers, or just like rerouting things. Lots of very funny pranks that they can play just by virtue of their unique role in the production process. But yeah, I mean, it's a good success story. I think it's also important to recognize that labor often has not found its own voice in the war movement or anti-war movement. Most famously, I guess, in like the First and Second World War, the big anti-war movement was like the socialists famously did not go along with refusing to fight, which is too bad. But also, well, this is kind of in the weeds, but I guess I'll mention it because it has my synapses fired in my brain. Um, Paul Verrillo, a weird philosopher we talk about on this podcast sometimes, a guy who wrote a ton about war and militarism. He famously was not a Marxist, and in part because he said the proletariat, the one revolutionary class that Marx hitched his wagon to and thought that was the key. Verrillo said, the problem with the proletariat is because of the logic of war and machines has kind of so like penetrated our society. The proletariat is sort of conscripted into the logic of war in a way that it like cannot understand or hasn't really come to consciousness about. And so, in a weird way, the proletariat or the working class is sort of like a bit of an organized soldier contingent in itself, right? They make the weapons. They don't really think twice about it. They get a paycheck for it. I always think about this when I look at like Raytheon in particular, which is just on Twitter, which blows my mind. I can't believe we live in a world where Raytheon can like show its face on the internet and not just get
It's
like,
too bad.
yeah, cyberbullied every day. So I don't know, do that if you're bored, I guess. But
Please.
Raytheon has like several accounts, and they're constantly bragging about how like they're a great employer and people love working for them. And it's like, yeah, but what they love doing is making new ways of killing people. Very awful. So Raytheon maybe is the most obvious, but like, even the major labor unions in both Canada and the US typically haven't really come to that political consciousness that they should, go on strike maybe if they're asked to make weapons, or maybe maybe people who are workers should make stronger demands about what they manufacture. And, this is a militant labor union that doesn't exist. So this is all kind of pie in the sky stuff. But it's just to say that, like, the labor movement is so kind of dormant in that way that it's hard to imagine that ever coming back. But the longshore workers are a testament to the continued possibilities of that, and like a great material proof of, if we organized at the point of production, then wars couldn't happen because you wouldn't produce the means of making war.
I think the Verrillo point is actually really a really good, strong critique of of Marxism, and it's pretty fascinating if you think about it, though, right? Like just because of the ways that production is so like kind of interconnected within a capitalist political economy, it's such a hard thing to even, and because you're so alienated from your labor, right? It's like so difficult for you to even know like what your labor is actually producing in the long run, right? Even if
Yeah.
you're just producing like, well, like for example, for years, my dad worked in a warehouse where they shipped wire places, and it's like, I don't know, where's all the wire going?
Right.
Like, like they sent some to the company that made Slinkies. They sent some to the U.S. government. So like, I don't know, you're making Slinkies, you're making bombs. Who knows, man? It's
Mm-hmm.
just like such a wild thing. But yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that is that if I was in some kind of like heavy manufacturing industry and I was in a union, that's the first question I'd be asking. Like, what are we actually making? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
If you want to insist on having control of your labor means like, I don't know, not making weapons if you don't want to.
Right.
Which, I mean, who wants to make weapons? I guess, but that's part of controlling your labor. That's part of having a democratic workplace for sure.
Yeah, there are some also, I should say, like, the labor movement as a whole hasn't come to that consciousness, but like there are factions of it that have, and kind of really neat groups. Like the one I'm most familiar with is Labor Against the Arms Trade. Um,
Yeah,
and it's what it sounds like, and it's very good.
there's one in the U.S. too called Labor Against War and Racism.
Oh, nice.
Just it's sort of like a a nonprofit sort of network of people who are in unions who are interested in anti-war activism. So like they exist, and maybe like you said, right, they're a good testament to like the role that labor has played in the past, and like the a promissory note for what labor could do in the future.
Yeah. But all that to say, anyway, it is very important to think about labor and its kind of historical relation to the peace movement and what it could be, perhaps. But it's also, as we said, a challenge. It's hard to revive that, especially if you're not unionized or your union is maybe a bit slack. So let's see. Maybe we could pull out another group. Christians would be the last group because they're the maybe they have their own kind of unique things going on. So I mentioned, another kind of high point for the anti-war movement was the civil society organizations. So the civil rights movement was happening simultaneously as the anti-Vietnam War movement was kind of happening and coming together. And it's really interesting to see how those two movements influenced one another, right? So, for instance, like Martin Luther King Jr. For a long time didn't really speak out against the Vietnam War for strategic reasons, and eventually thought that wasn't tenable. Maybe we could talk more about that later, but important to kind of see that these struggles are connected, and at the most like militant moment in U.S. history, maybe like the 60s through the 70s, when people were really, able to get out there, like able to get in the streets and were willing to show up and do something. It was the recognition that these things are all tied together that was so significant, right? So, like right now, in the US or in Canada, we have some really militant movements against racism, and that's great, very, very good. And there are sections of those movements that also recognize these connections, right? So it's not like that intuition is lost in kind of the logic of social movements, but with the absence of like a mass anti-Vietnam War movement and the presence of a mass anti-racist movement, we could say the fact that we don't have those two things going on at the same time basically means you're kind of just like hoping that one of the mass movements will like start connecting some of the dots, but like, I don't know,
Yeah.
good luck. So important to sort of build those mass movements on so many different fronts all at once, which is exhausting, but that's how they did in the 60s and 70s, and I think it's the only way that it could really work.
Yeah, I think that's right. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, let's talk about the Christian part now. That's a big piece of it.
Yeah.
Um, in the 60s and the 70s, and I mean even after that too, but and before that even, right? There were all kinds of pretty radical Christians who were interested in opposing war in one way or another. Martin Luther King Jr. He was in the mix. He was out there. Just today, I read Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech called "Beyond Vietnam," which is a really fascinating essay about um, his turn to be outspokenly against the Vietnam War, and it's pretty powerful. It's really interesting. There's a lot of interesting political analysis, and some of it I don't think holds up, and some of it does for sure. Anyway, so people like Martin Luther King Jr. for sure are like important voices in just what you're saying, Dean, like the civil rights movement, but also how it ends up connecting to anti-war movement. But also, there's all kinds of other wild Christians out there, especially within what's called the plowshares movement. We've talked about folks that are kind of involved in plowshares in one way or another on this podcast before, like Daniel Berrigan. Um, but these are the groups of Christians. I guess a lot of Catholics, a lot of priests and nuns, and but also Protestants too, Protestant clergy and lay people vandalizing or disrupting what's going on like military bases.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of my heroes for sure. I think I've said on this podcast before, like really the probably the most major contribution of US Catholicism to sort of like the big book of Christian lefty activism is the anti-war movement, right? That really radical kind of pacifist tradition. One that has the courage to do things like the Catonsville Nine, if you've ever heard of them, which was the Berrigan brothers and a handful of other folks. They broke into an office where there were Vietnam War draft records, and they stole them, and then they burned them with some homemade napalm, and then they all eventually got arrested. Daniel Berrigan famously evaded the FBI by like bouncing around to people's houses for several months. Very fun story if you've never heard about it, so you can look that up. There's some good documentaries about it. But the real key here is at some point, there was this kind of awakening, I guess, among certain Catholics who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War stuff and also involved oftentimes in the civil rights movement. They sort of had this epiphany that, war is a really bad thing. And if you want to confront it, maybe you have to confront it in these big performative ways, like ways that have sort of spiritual significance to them and also this material significance. Like literally burning draft documents is a very good thing. You can't really do that anymore. I guess they're probably all on a computer. I don't know. Who knows?
You could burn computers.
Yeah, you could burn computers
for different reasons.
Yeah. But, the point being, I guess, that it was also a way to, in the left, there's this kind of idea that's often debated about whether or not these kind of isolated actions are strategically useful, right? There's lots of different names for it, but the idea being that like you go out, you do a big thing, you get arrested on purpose, or you kind of do something that just rattles the public, and then that alone is kind of supposed to be like a public pedagogy or whatever. The debate is that like certainly you can get people's attention, but if you can't integrate those people into like an organized program or an organization with other folks, then you're just going to look like a bunch of weirdos. And I think
it's true.
Sometimes these people do look like a bunch of weirdos, but there are weirdos, right, and they're very good, and they had an effect on me for sure. And in my own case, they've kind of put me on a path to eventually finding more organized politics, I think. But it's important, I think, to really highlight that in U.S. and Canadian Christianity, there is this incredible tradition of civil disobedience, of a really militant anti-war movement that is like willing to, people have like put their freedoms and their bodies on the line to say we don't want a world where there are things like nuclear weapons that can blow it up. We don't want a world where people are drafted and they have to fly to a different country and like shoot a bunch of people and, on behalf of our national interest or whatever. Like, we don't want that, right? And being willing to say that we're going to go do that is really brave. And it's also a tradition that is still with us today, right? Like, we have been hearing all the time about like the Kings Bay 7, a bunch of folks who have carried on this tradition just in recent years. Or you could think of like Jessica Resnicek, who her and Ruby Montoya, they did some property destruction with the DAPL pipeline, right? And lots of stuff going on there. So the tradition is alive and well, but I think it's such an important feature that we don't often think about either, that in the Christian tradition, there's this kind of strong militant anti-war piece that we could tap into the kind of energies of at the very least.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's really important, I think. I mean, maybe like you said a minute ago, right? They can be weirdos, but they are definitely are weirdos, and we have to we have to own it, I guess, for better and sometimes for worse. But I think mostly for the better. I think that sort of prophetic witness is something that's really inspiring and pretty cool. Here's an important quote from I think Daniel Berrigan on the topic in general. This is from a 1970 book called "No Bars to Manhood." We have assumed the name of peacemakers, but we have been, by and large, unwilling to pay any significant price. And because we want the peace with half a heart and half a life and will, the war, of course, continues because the waging of war, by its nature, is total. But the waging of peace by our own cowardice is partial. There's no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as exigent, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace and prison and death in its wake. This is the kind of thing that I think is, I mean, it's powerful, and I think that um, there's something right that in what Daniel Berrigan's saying. It's also like a little overbearing, but I think he's right. I think there's an analysis in here that we should probably pay attention to. That like I mean, just like he says, war is total, right? War is total in the sense that like in the United States, mountains of money are diverted towards war and away from other things. War is total in the sense that in the United States, money is diverted towards war and away from other things. Right? It's people's full time job to wage war, and not just to wage war, but to study how to wage war. You know, you can go to I don't know like military academy and learn learn all about the best strategies. You can become a software engineer just to make apps that kill people and like control drones. I know all of this to say though, just that like war is a full time job of somebody, and that there's an entire like industry built around it. So you have to think that you have to build at least enough power to stop that, and that's a pretty tall order, right? There's a lot of organizing to do. There's a lot of power to build. Yeah, I think that the language that strikes me as unhelpful is that it's only our cowardice that's standing in our way. I don't know if that's exactly true. I guess maybe some of that's true. I'm willing to say I'm a little bit afraid to like get shot or something, but you know, I think really more than anything, it's our just the lack of time people have to organize. I don't know, like it is people's full time job to do war, but like it's no one's full time job to oppose war, or you know, it's always it's something that you do because you're really passionate about it, and it's a hard thing to even wrap your mind around how total it is. Just like we were saying, right? You don't even know if you're producing something industrially or whatever, or even if you're doing the cognitive labor of like coding or whatever, you have no idea what your code's going to be used for. You don't know what your product's going to be used for. Like because war is so total, it's hard to even figure out how to oppose it in a way that is as systemic and as far reaching as war actually is.
Yeah, I think it's a good point too to recognize kind of the I guess like I don't want to use the word human resources, but I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. Like the the imbalance of human attention, or like
Hmm.
enabling full time human attention on these kinds of issues, right? Like the U.S. military is always going to have more people, more money than the peace movement is ever going to have. I mean, there are some people whose full time job it is to make peace. Like I think of community peacemaker teams, formerly Christian peacemaker teams. They have some paid staff, but not nearly as many as the U.S. military will ever have, right?
It's
Um,
true. That's true. I guess that what I mean to say though is that like you know you can go to school and you can get a
yeah,
job and have a career and like live your entire life
right,
contributing to doing war and making people's lives awful and
right,
killing
yeah,
people, right?
yes,
And
exactly,
there's no similar track for Christian peacemaker teams. Like you're not
right,
gonna have like a pension. You're not gonna have like I don't know, a housing allowance to live in a city or something like you would if
yeah.
you're in the military. It's just there's a scale of difference that I think is worth noting.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also important to note the change of material conditions here as well. So, we were talking about some of these examples from history, and
Mm.
like they're all very cool and interesting. But something that always sticks with me, like, I don't know, sometimes you read a book and you forget like everything about it except like a quote. And that is the case for me with this book called Revolution in the Air by Max Lbaum. It's kind of a study of like radicals in the 70s mostly, and this kind of period, right? And really, it talks quite a lot about the Vietnam War protests and kind of how they mutate and transform and everything. It's all very good. You should read it. It's a great book, a good history book. But the thing that really sticks out to me is he emphasizes that, like, during that time, one thing that really made all that happen was the fact that wages and housing prices were correlated in such a way that, like, you could have a single person in a house working full time, supporting like two other roommates who live in that house who are organizing full time and don't have full time jobs. And like that is how the movement happened, right? Like somebody volunteered to work and pay the rent so that two other people could go get everybody else excited about, going down to the rally. And now wages and rents are such that you could never ever do that again.
Right.
Like you can't have somebody just go get a job for a little bit and support two roommates in a house in, definitely not in an urban center for sure. And it matters that we recognize those material changes to our ability to organize too. I think, as a person now who is involved in organizing a lot, like I often am, everybody who does organizing work, I think you have these days of like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to do this? Like, it's impossible to get all these people to do the things I feel we need them to do, or like, I'm not doing my job right, or whatever, right? Like, you have these kind of days where you feel like you're just kind of banging your head against the wall a little bit. But it's always been helpful to me to be like, well, it was actually a lot easier to do this like 50 years ago, and like seeing what we're working with now, the demands on our attention and all that kind of stuff. Like, I agree. Maybe Daniel Berrigan could have talked about, our cowardice being sort of a bigger piece in 1970. I think that there's some truth to that still now in 2022. But there's also a lot of other things that have changed. And as we think about like what it would mean to do the practical work of organizing, that's really what it's going to take. We're like donating money to things like community peacemaker teams, right? Donating money to organizations like Pax Christi, allowing us to kind of build out a real staffing network that would allow people to do that full time. It's like there's a danger of professionalizing all these things. We have to have volunteers and members. Like, that is completely true and really significant. But at the same time, like, it takes resources, and there's a lot of resources being put into war all the time, not nearly as many resources being put into peace, and we have to sort that out.
That's right. Well, let's talk about those resources really quick before we kind of wrap up the episode here, because it's an important piece of the puzzle. As we're transitioning away from like the historical aspect and towards like what does it mean to like oppose like militarization as a sort of societal logic, because I think that is definitely what you might call it. There's a word that I've learned lately that I think is pretty helpful for kind of understanding what some of this looks like. This is a term that I don't know. I've heard people from I don't know, all over use it, I guess, but like it kind of comes out of the again, sort of like that sort of like civil rights era anti-war movement, like the Martin Luther King era anti-war movement. And I've heard people like Liz Theo Harris and Reverend Barber, they've used the word too, but it's war economy. Um, so war economy is the idea that like like within the capitalist system, right? We have a political economy where people are like earn wages and all that kind of stuff. But the war economy is like is the recognition that like so much money is poured into making war, just like we've been talking about for the last few minutes. So much money is being poured into like, yeah, building bombs, paying people at the Pentagon to, I don't know, fly airplanes over other countries. I don't know what people do at the Pentagon, probably that. I have no idea. But anyways, it's the idea that doing war is like a whole industry within itself, and that's also like part of the reason why resources don't exist for other social safety net kind of things. So I'm going to read this quote here from Liz Theo Harris, who is she's the director of the Cairo Center and also the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. She says this: the U.S. war-making budget is well over $700 billion a year. And this was written, I guess, a little bit ago, but it's still true. Joe Biden just asked for, I don't know, $700+ billion for the Pentagon. So that sucks. Anyways, all I'm trying to say here is that that's still an accurate number. The war making budget is well over $700 billion a year. That's more than the next 10 countries combined, 53 cents of every dollar in the federal discretionary budget. For comparison, when Donald Trump tried to kick 700,000 poor people out of the life-saving food stamps program last year, it was justified by expected savings of 1 billion per year. So uh, cutting people off of food stamps, it's only going to save you 1 billion per year, but the Pentagon, the military budget is over 700 billion. So not even not even justifiable. It's completely ridiculous. All right, and she goes on to say every dollar spent on feeding this war machine is a dollar not spent on housing, on healthcare, on education, on jobs, on preventing pandemics, on confronting the climate crisis in a country beset on searing poverty, gaping inequality, and widespread environmental injustice. The overblown Pentagon budget is not just a case of mismatched priorities, it's a war on the poor. Okay. There's a lot I appreciate in this analysis, and I think it's pretty powerful. I think framing it as a war on the poor is exactly right. I mean, I don't know. It's a war on other people. It's a war economy. It's an economy that's built around giving more than $700 billion every year to the Pentagon, and in response, I mean that means that money not being spent on things that people actually need. So I guess like I lay all this out because I mean, first of all, you can see the moral injustice in that that people in the United States are, I mean, right now facing evictions, going hungry, they have no health care, they have jobs that pay them a really crappy wage, all of this, right? And also climate change and all of that. That's just kind of like looming in the background, coming to burn us all to death. But even though that's the case, that's all fine. That's all justifiable. There's just not money in the budget for it. Sorry, well maybe next year we can kind of like close that inequality gap just a little bit if we kind of can move some dollars and cents around. Meanwhile, every Republican and every Democrat will unproblematically vote yes, or nearly all of them. Okay, there's a few okay people out there, but nearly all of them will vote yes on giving the Pentagon over $700 billion for their budget. And Joe Biden can easily get away with asking for, 770 billion, whatever it was. And people won't even bat an eye on it because it's just like the way things work, right? It's just that the economy of the United States kind of has of the United States government has that sort of idea and ideology sort of built into it. Um, but I mean, I think that kind of goes along with what we were just saying, right? To oppose war, to oppose the whole idea of militarism, to oppose the idea, to oppose the system of militarism in the country means to try to figure out ways to thwart that particular economic move of just dumping money in a big pile
Mm-hmm.
for people in the Pentagon to, like, I don't know, make into tanks or whatever. Um, so I don't know. It's not a insignificant problem, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It's just such a bummer, right? Like, uh, people like Joe Manchin or whoever, right? They will draw out these long and tedious like hand wringing sessions where they cry on and on about how much it's going to cost to continue on the child tax credit, right? And how actually we need to means test it, and we can't make sure that the wrong people get money. That would be so awful. Meanwhile, they are just gonna like shove, eh, s- an unimaginable amount of money to people that want to build more guns, and no one's gonna cry about it.
Mm-hmm.
So confronting not only the ideology of militarism where that kind of makes sense, but the material reality where that happens and the political situation that makes that okay, that is also a part of the anti-war movement, or it has to be right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to kind of sort of round out the conversation toward the end here is to say, like, it's important to get a sense of the scale of the problem, and it's also important to then think about how to do that practical organizing piece. I don't know. At some point, we have to do an episode, I guess, just on organizing in general. But like,
Yeah.
I think, you mentioned earlier, Matt, that that can be a vague term, and I think that's right. So maybe I'll just kind of say a few things that might be a little less vague, a little more detailed, right? So, like one way, for instance, if we wanted to really rebuild the anti war movement, if we wanted to take inspiration from those things that we were talking about a little while ago, different kind of witnesses for peace and so on, and if we wanted to confront the gravity of the situation that you were just laying out here, the material situation, we really have to think, I think, extremely practically about how to do that. So the way I always think about organizing is like there's lots of different features of it, and they're all very important, and you kind of have to like do them all at once, but you have to do them with a bunch of other people, or else you'll never get anything done. So One I think is education. That's like a major domain. And there's lots of interesting ways to do that. Like the thing you just read from Liz Theo Harris is a great example of trying to contextualize what does it mean for us to spend so much on the military budget and not spend it on these other things, right? And just trying to make that clear for folks. Like it's a war on the poor insofar as if you are a poor person or even a working class person for that matter, you can't get access to healthcare because people tell you it's too expensive for the government to have it, to offer it. But the government will spend all this other money. If you can kind of draw those connections out for people, I do think that that is like a major piece. So there's kind of a education or propaganda side to organizing that's very important. And I think that is actually essential, right? It's great if people have basic graphic design skills, communication skills. You can make a little pamphlet. You can host a, I don't know, conversation at your church or whatever. You're a pastor or teacher or something, right? Coming up with those kind of easy ways to educate is important. And secondly is the mobilization piece, really trying to figure out ways to get people out at like the US consulate or get people out at the Russian consulate or embassy, right? Getting people out in the streets, meeting each other, saying what they are upset about. That is sort of the tried and true method of anti-war movements. If you can get enough people out in the streets, you can maybe start getting a hearing. I don't think everyone has to be a Daniel Berrigan. Like, I don't think that everybody has to break into, a nuclear submarine facility and pour your blood on like a missile warhead or something. I mean, if you want to do
That's
that,
cool though.
yeah, I'll say that you're great and I'll tell other people that you're great too. But like, I'm not going to do it. So, it's important too to recognize that we also have to do that kind of mobilizing work. And to do that, it really takes investment in long-term organizations, like things with infrastructure, apparatuses, people who know what they're doing, like something like Pax Christi or Christian Peacemaker teams, like organizations that already have experience doing that stuff. And I think that's really the key, right? Trying to figure out how you can connect a lot of people at once to the same kind of cause, bring them in with their own kind of interests. And like, that's a lot of work in itself. But doing that kind of education side on the one hand and the mobilization side on the other, I always see those as kind of like the two basic prongs, at least, of organizing. And if you were going to do anti-war stuff, even more, that comes into relief, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we could talk about organizing for a long time, but I mean, that's basically it, right? Organizing is about growing and moving a network of influence to do something that you want. I think that's at least a place to start. But I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to think of when the word organizing kind of became in vogue, and I don't really know the answer to that question. I mean, people have been talking about organizing forever, right? From labor, from leftist politics, and so on. But I feel like it entered the sort of like the popular consciousness maybe at the end of the last election cycle
Yeah.
when Georgia won, and people were like, "Well, how did the Democrats get any wins in a place like Georgia?" And everyone was like, "It's the organizers, stupid." And like that's true, man. But like organizing is a whole thing that takes a lot of people. That takes a
Yeah.
lot of time and a lot of strategy. And yeah, it does warrant a larger conversation. But it is what you have to do. And like whenever you are educating people, whenever you're trying to you're moving someone to try to get them to do something, that's doing organizing work. Whether or not it'll be effective is another story, but something else altogether.
Yeah.
A good note. Well, okay, so we're kind of coming up to the end here. And I think that there's one more point that I want to make, especially kind of coming off this whole idea, right? There's been a historic anti-war movement in the United States, and it's very interesting and full of contradictions, but also full of very cool things and things that make me excited right now, even just thinking about them. Um, and there is like the current state of things. If you think about the war economy and how much money is spent on war and militarism, and the whole like, sort of ideology behind it, where people don't even really care that you're spending that much money on war and militarism. There's all of that, but also like I think that there's something to be said about the role that religious people can play in these types of things. Yeah, I mean, throughout this episode, we've been talking about Reverend Liz Theo Harris and William Barber, two people who are they're both pastors in different types of Christian traditions, and also Pax Christi too. Another that's a Catholic organization. I think that it's really important to draw out that religious people have a really important place within organizing. I mean, for a few different reasons, but I think just for a very practical reason that they are representatives of certain communities that have a commitment to care about things. So it is great to figure out ways to activate those types of people, I think, for sure, and maybe something we can return to in the future. Though I guess I want to pull out one more thread of the current situation and like thinking about like what does it mean to oppose this current war situation in Ukraine, and there is this element within it of Christian nationalism that I think is really fascinating that I've been reading a little bit about today and yesterday as well. Um, so let's see. I don't know if you've ever heard of Diana Butler Bass. You probably have. She's on Twitter. She's an academic, but she's also kind of like a popular figure. I like her. She's great. For the most part, I don't know. I guess the critical support, I suppose. Anyways, there's this really interesting write up today in Esquire by a liberal pundit. Doesn't matter. Anyways, he was writing about the Christian nationalist roots of the ongoing situation in Ukraine and in Russia, and he kept on citing Diana Butler Bass and some of her work on Christian nationalism. That's one of her, I guess, kind of like core research topics when it comes to religious history. She's a historian, by the way. I don't know if I said that, but I should have. Anyways, so this is a quote from Diana Butler Bass. The dream gripping some quarters of the West is for a coalition to unify religious conservatives into a kind of supranational neo-Christendom. The theory is to create a partnership between American evangelicals, traditionalist Catholics in Western countries, and Orthodox people under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church in a common front against the three enemies, decadent secularism, a rising China, and Islam, for a glorious rebirth of moral purity in Christian culture. So there are some ways that this ties into Putin explicitly, and also, like, I don't know, if you live in the United States or in Canada, take a look around you. Not super hard to see how these things kind of been playing out in the current resurgence of a different type of right wing politics, or a way that maybe right wing politics have mutated over the last few years. Um, anyways, I'm drawing this point out here to say that in this moment, it's probably really important for progressive Christians or just religious people of all varieties to to think about that organizing work and what it looks like to do that in your own communities. Yeah, I think that when it comes to Christian nationalism here is referring to a type of right wing Christian nationalism, not like the Maoist type or something. An important distinction that we make on this podcast and this podcast only. But anyways, all to say, it's important to kind of keep sight of that in the way that the ideology bound up in Christian nationalism in the United States is not only a United States phenomena. It has sort of some purchase in different places, like I don't know, like in Russia, for example. And as we're doing this organizing work, as we're thinking about the anti-war movement, as we're thinking about how to, I don't know, confront these structures and these ideologies, I think that we can't neglect the moral voice of a type of Christianity that refuses right wing Christian nationalism. So, just probably an important point to throw out here at the very end.
Yeah, and I mean, one that is also recognized by the Christian peace movement of the past as well, right? Like,
Hmm.
you see that a lot in Berrigan's poetry, for example, a kind of explicit attack on U.S. Christian nationalism for sure. We've talked in the past about Dorothy Zoela, this amazing German theologian, and she taught in the United States for a long time, and she coined this term Christofascism, which she used to try to describe the conditions in the U.S. And she was also a really staunch anti-war activist herself. So important to also carry that thread on, and it's good that you bring that up, Matt. That we can recognize that Christians have some unique opportunities by virtue of our communities that we're part of, but also some unique responsibilities that, like, we have to confront Christian nationalism also kind of on its own terrain, which is, you know, our tradition. And it's important to confront it materially, rhetorically, spiritually, biblically, whatever, whatever by any means necessary, I guess. But
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. I guess I want to make it clear too that I'm not just like conjuring this as like a boogeyman from nowhere or
yeah,
something. I don't know. I've seen all kinds of really weird right wing figures kind of coming out and talking up Christian nationalism in this moment. Even
yeah.
Steve Bannon the other day was talking about how cool it was that that Putin has this sort of Christian nationalist vision that doesn't make room for like people with multiple genders or different gender expressions or different sexual expressions or whatever. And I think that sucks ass. Fuck Steve Bannon. Hate this guy.
He's a bad one.
Christian nationalism in general, right-wing Christian nationalism. I don't like it. I think it's bad, and I'll even swear about it. I don't care.
Wow. Well, you've got it really at the end here. Matt's coming in hot. He came in hot in the beginning, and now he's coming in hot at the end.
That's right.
Well,
I
there
kind
you
of fell
have
asleep
it.
in the middle, but now I'm back.
War is bad. We should organize a movement that says so loudly all the time and bug the people who are still doing it. Just here's the fine point I'll put on the end. If you want to do something specific, I don't know, print off a bunch of posters and go put them up around town saying that war is bad. Get a bunch of friends together and tell them you want to make a campaign that says, I don't know, what if we spent 1/700th of the budget on feeding people in the United States? Like, I don't know what it is, but get a group of people together, think about it, and find some way of maybe creating some mobilization or some education resources against war. That's my Magnificast homework. I've never given any out on this podcast, and for the first time, that's it. We all have a good assignment. I'm going to do it myself. We'll all think of a way of confronting our own home country's participation in war, because peace is global, because war is global. That's my big slogan at the end.
A good slogan. Put it on a sticker.
Put it on a sticker. That'll be our extremely small contribution.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us there, you get access to our cool Discord group chat where we talk about all kinds of great and nice things. We have a channel for pets now, and I think that's really uplifting. Everyone's posting their cute pets, and I love them. I love them all, and I want to give them a good smooch on the forehead. The pets, not the people posting. I'm sure they're great too, but I want to kiss your pets, is what I'm here to say. After COVID, let me come to your house and kiss your pets. All right. You can also get things like stickers or whatever, but that's not important. Not as important as me kissing those cats you got. Okay. You can also give us a review on iTunes or any other podcasting platform. We'd appreciate it. I haven't looked in a long time to see if we have any new ones, and I'm sure there's a lot of them out there. We used to read them at the beginning of every episode, but we're not doing that anymore. So leave one, but I won't ever read it. Just kidding. I will eventually. Cool. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else.